Have you or a loved one faced a medical emergency or prepared for a serious medical procedure? If so, you know how stressful that can be. Psalm 41:3 promises that Jehovah will sustain us on our sickbed. How does he do this? Not through miraculous cures, but by lovingly providing physical, emotional, and spiritual support. One means of support is the Hospital Liaison Committee arrangement. Today, more than 16,000 brothers serve on or coordinate some 2,000 liaison committees around the world. How do they assist?
Our role is to help doctors and Jehovah's Witnesses to come to a consensus on how to treat the patient without breaking God's law.
You've just been watching the intro to a brief video released in 2020 that celebrated the HLC, or Hospital Liaison Committee, arrangement. As you heard, there are 16,000 Jehovah's Witness elders assigned to some 2,000 HLCs globally. And their mission is
to help doctors and Jehovah's Witnesses to come to a consensus on how to treat the patient without breaking God's law.
And that's a diplomatic way of saying our role is to interfere in the administering of medical treatment and make sure blood is never transfused into a patient, even if it means them dying. After all, if there's one thing nearly everyone knows about Jehovah's Witnesses, it's that they refuse blood transfusions, even for children who, for obvious reasons, aren't in a position to take a religious stance on anything, let alone complex medical issues. What you won't hear HLC elders say when they're helping doctors to reach this consensus is that Jehovah's Witnesses are literally punished with expulsion if they accept a transfusion. As it says in their secret manual, Shepherd the Flock of God, under the heading willingly and unrepentantly accepting blood, if the elders on the committee, that's judicial committee, determine that he is unrepentant, they should announce his disassociation. In the context of Jehovah's Witnesses, disassociation means being shunned by everyone the person knows who are believers, including close family members. You can understand why someone would rather die than risk being cut off from everyone they care about. Anyway, it's one thing for adults to be coerced into refusing blood under penalty of shunning, but what about children? Jehovah's Witnesses have a long history of celebrating the fact that they allow children to martyr themselves refusing blood due to the beliefs of their parents. Exhibit A, this infamous 1994 Awake magazine, which gave the stories of multiple children who were effectively killed by the religious beliefs of their JW mothers and fathers. And Exhibit B, the following video from 2019.
In the days of distress, they arrived early on Jared at 11.
Jared was diagnosed with lymphoma cancer in the middle of 1991. We started trying to figure out how we could get him the treatment that he needed, of course, but in no way would we accept a blood transfusion, and neither would Jared. He died in June of 1992. He was at home, and the last thing he said to us was, "Work hard so we can all be together again."
Needless to say, the late Jared Scepter's story is heartbreaking and enraging in equal measure. Rather than go over it again, I will instead point you to my rebuttal, The Martyrdom of Jared Scepter, where you'll be able to watch the full video along with my thoughts. Put simply, it's no secret whatsoever that when it comes to the prohibition of blood transfusions, the children of Jehovah's Witnesses are expected to pay the ultimate price if necessary. And that brings us to a leaked video from 2015 that has just been brought to our attention at JW Watch, thanks to an insider who happens to be one of those 16,000 HLC elders. The video in question shows governing body member Mark Sanderson giving guidance to HLC elders on how they are to manage pediatric and neonatal cases. For copyright reasons, I'm restricted legally from making the entire video available unedited, but fair use provisions of copyright law do allow me to comment on it. So let's take a look.
Jehovah's Witnesses love their children. Isn't that true? And for that reason, when they're sick or they face some terrible medical problem, we want the very best medical care that we can possibly find for them without the use of blood transfusions.
But what if the very best care requires a blood transfusion? If you really care about children and the health of children, shouldn't saving their lives be the absolute priority above all else? And what does it say that Mark is talking to HLC elders in terms of what we want? If refusing blood transfusions is really a personal choice made by Jehovah's Witnesses, or in this case, Jehovah's Witness parents, shouldn't it be all about what they want?
Well, in the following discussion, we're going to discuss some of the common problems that are particularly experienced in dealing with the care of newborns. And then we're also going to review some of the basic principles that are involved in the medical and legal issues that arise in treating minors in general. Now, it's well known that preterm infants in the neonatal intensive care unit receive a greater number of red cell transfusions than any other group of hospitalized patients. Isn't that amazing to think of? Now, let's consider two main reasons, two main problems that arise in the care of these neonates. Here's the first, the anemia of prematurity. Now, all infants after birth will experience a decrease in their hemoglobin concentration. Why is that? Well, in the womb, the infant is in a situation where there's relatively low levels of oxygen. As soon as it's born, now it's exposed to an environment where there's oxygen everywhere. And so the tissue oxygenation goes up immediately. And how does the body respond? Well, it stops producing the same level of EPO, and as a result, the blood count starts to drop. Well, that's a normal situation for every newborn infant. Usually they're asymptomatic, there's no problem at all. But what about the premature infant? In the premature infant, this situation is greatly exaggerated. And there is definitely a negative response by the preterm infant to this normal transition. While the blood count may be very, very low in the premature infant, at the same time, the level of EPO in the bloodstream is also very, very low. So there's very little output. Very, very few red cells are being created in this little preterm infant. But now keep in mind, what is the blood volume of a preterm infant? On average, it's this. This is the full blood volume, 4 to 5 ounces for a preterm infant. If the infant is smaller, it would be even less.
We're watching Mark Sanderson, a man with precisely 0 medical qualifications or credentials that it takes literally years of study to acquire, giving a medical lecture to a room full of HLC elders who will also lack medical qualifications or credentials, so that they can approach doctors while trying to reach a consensus on medical treatment and pretend to know as much about how to treat anemia in babies as they do. And as if to demonstrate just how utterly ill-equipped Mark is to assume this role of inserting himself in life or death medical decisions, he expresses surprise and wonder that tiny babies are born with a comparatively tiny amount of blood in their bodies.
So now when you think of this, how could we minimize the risk of transfusion in such premature infants? Well, here's 4 simple things that can be done. The first one, delay cutting and clamping the umbilical cord. Why? Well, if more blood comes down from the placenta into the infant, how much better the situation is. If the baby has more blood inside, less risk of transfusion later. Just common sense, a common sense intervention that will just help to ease the situation later. Here's the second one. Well, now it's only common sense. If this is the full blood volume, we're going to have to restrict phlebotomy. Wouldn't you agree? Because if they're continually taking blood samples, if they're taking large samples, what's going to happen? Well, obviously, this volume is going to be depleted in almost no time. So trying to get the doctors to get out of the habit of just doing routine tests, and at the same time, as was mentioned earlier, using microsampling, using transcutaneous monitoring, non-invasive testing, all of these things will help to avoid a transfusion later.
He's so obviously not talking about the interests of the baby. He's talking about the interests of his religious organization and making sure these are enforced in a medical setting to the extent of telling doctors how to do their jobs. It's chilling to consider that literally thousands of HLC elders will have watched this video, likely some of whom are operating in your locality, and therefore feel entitled and sufficiently well informed to make recommendations to medical professionals about how many blood samples to take from an anemic baby or at what point to cut the umbilical cord.
We've already covered the use of erythropoietic stimulating agents, EPO, darbepoetin. These can be of tremendous help to this premature infant in getting the red cell production going. And even just simple hematinics like iron, folic acid, vitamin B12, all of these are going to contribute to getting the blood count up. And finally, just permitting anemia, just tolerating a higher degree of anemia can be a significant contributor to avoiding a transfusion.
Of course, what a genius idea. If a baby is anemic, if a baby has insufficient red blood cells so that there isn't enough oxygen getting to its body tissues and vital organs, why not allow it? Why not urge the doctor to just stand back and do nothing? What's the worst that could happen?
What's the second cause for so many transfusions in these small infants? Well, it's the hemolytic disease of the newborn. What's that? Well, for a variety of different reasons. A mother may begin to form antibodies that enter the bloodstream of the infant, and these antibodies will cause destruction of the red blood cells of the infant. Now, as these red blood cells are being destroyed, bilirubin is being released. As the bilirubin count begins to go higher and higher, the doctors begin to panic. They're afraid with that high bilirubin count that there is going to be permanent brain damage on the part of the child. We call that, or they call that condition, hyperbilirubinemia. And it's a long word, and basically all it means is a high bilirubin count. Well, what is the doctor going to recommend under that circumstance? Most often, the doctor is going to recommend what's called an exchange transfusion. They're going to ask basically to flush out the blood volume of the infant with the blood of another person. Now, how can we try to avoid that situation? What are some alternatives? Here's 3. Phototherapy. Now, many years ago, that was somewhat revolutionary. But now, in most neonatal intensive care units, phototherapy has become a greatly accepted procedure, and it's widely available. If there is a situation, sometimes in the developing world or in other countries where there just isn't access to these very focused phototherapy units, sometimes doctors can just use fluorescent lights. And if even that's not available, they can just take the baby out and put it in the sun. Many years ago, maybe some of you remember when a baby was called jaundiced. Well, that's the same condition we're talking about here. And the way that people would take care of it years gone by was just put the baby in the sun. That's what all of the midwives and others would always do to treat that.
Your eyes and ears do not deceive you. Mark Sanderson is here discussing hemolytic disease in newborns, a condition that can lead to, what was it again?
Permanent brain damage on the part of the child.
Sorry, thanks, Mark. Permanent brain damage on the part of the child. And among the recommendations for medical treatment offered by Mark is taking the sick baby outside and exposing it to sunshine.
And if even that's not available, they can just take the baby out and put it in the sun.
Just for context, we're talking here about a situation where the consequences for getting the treatment wrong can range from permanent brain damage to death. And governing body member Mark Sanderson is instructing thousands of HLC elders worldwide to urge putting a sick baby in the sun while its life is ebbing away, rather than allowing a blood transfusion. Again, there's clearly no medical wisdom behind this advice. It's not about the health and well-being of the baby. It's all about keeping someone else's blood out of the baby's body at all costs. And notice how Mark introduces this non-qualified, non-certified medical wisdom.
They're going to ask basically to flush out the blood volume of the infant with the blood of another person. Now, how can we try to avoid that situation? What are some alternatives?
How can we try to avoid that situation? How can HLC elders try to avoid that situation? Not how can parents try to avoid that situation? Not how can we advise parents who request suggestions regarding alternative treatments that they can discuss with their doctor. No. Again, this isn't about personal choice. The language here is direct and unmistakable. This has nothing to do with letting parents decide or helping reach any genuine consensus on how babies are treated. This is all about enforcing a religious command, even if it results in the baby's death.
The second way that we might avoid a transfusion is using a product called tin-mesoporphyrin. Now, tin-mesoporphyrin is not available presently on the market. It can't be purchased or prescribed. But this product has the ability to block the production of bilirubin. And so if the bilirubin count is very high, if tin-mesoporphyrin is given, almost immediately the bilirubin count will begin to drop. So how can you get access to this product if you have a case like that? Well, contact HIS, because there is a compassionate use program that the company has through the FDA to be able to release the product for compassionate use in witness patients. So HIS can give you more information as to how you would go about getting it.
For not the last time in this video, HLC elders are here urged to contact HIS. In this case, it seems HIS can pull a few strings and help parents get access to medicine for their babies that is otherwise difficult to obtain. In case you're wondering, HIS, or Hospital Information Services, is essentially the help desk for HLC elders. It's the resource they go running to when things are going bad. And interestingly, Mark Sanderson is described as spending time working in this department during his rapid rise up the organisational ladder to where he is today, a governing body member. Last year, I had the opportunity to interview a man named Daniel Graves shortly after he had defected from the United States branch office at Walkill, New York. Among other roles during his time working as a Bethelite, or Jehovah's Witness volunteer staff member, Daniel told me he'd spent 3.5 years answering calls from HLC elders as an overseer's secretary for the hospital information desk. When I pressed him for the number of Jehovah's Witnesses who had died refusing blood over this period, this was his response.
Okay, and so in 3.5 years of doing this, are you able to tell us how many Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States died?
It would be very hard for me to put a number on it because not every case comes to the HLC, and not every case that the HLC get comes to the national headquarters. So a lot of things, a lot of the trauma, motorcycle accidents, people on blood thinners that just quickly bleed out, we would get wind of that. And every week we were abreast of somebody that had passed away, or we would get a note by somebody from the HLC that something had happened. But to actually, collate that and down to a funnel and say, this is the actual number, I just don't think that could ever be the case.
Okay. If I can press you,
Sure.
would it be, if there were a number, would it be in the dozens or the hundreds or the thousands?
Per day, per month? I mean, what are we talking about? A
in
year?
the 3.5 year period that you were doing it?
Oh, no. Thousands. People, it's very common. I mean, this blood issue, especially with COVID and some other things that we saw there, it played a role at times. And so people go in for what would be a normal valve replacement, but then they don't have the blood count or the bone marrow to really create baby RBCs, reticulocytes, and then they just naturally become anemic. So many sickle cell for little children. That was a sad thing because it's just a small crisis. And if you could just get over that hump, it'd be fine.
Hopefully this clip will help put everything in context, especially if you happen to be watching this video as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. When it comes to talking about the blood teaching, we are not talking about personal choice or blood alternatives as a preferable form of treatment. We are talking about a religious command instituted as relatively recently as 1945, a command that must be observed no matter what, and which has already claimed the lives of literally thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses and their children.
The third thing that could be done is high-dose neonatal intravenous immune globulin. This may be of help when the immune system is working overtime to destroy these red blood cells. However, again, because immunoglobulin is a plasma fraction, we'd have to be careful to make sure the family understood the conscience matters that are involved in making that decision.
You'll notice there Mark Sanderson talking about the conscience matters surrounding the use of immunoglobulin. That's because since 2000, Jehovah's Witnesses have been allowed to have blood fractions. In other words, almost any product derived from blood that isn't one of what's considered its 4 main components: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. When it comes to pretty much everything other than those 4 components, Jehovah's Witnesses are allowed to make their own decision on whether to accept the treatment based on their conscience. You might think that it would be an easy choice for Jehovah's Witnesses to accept blood fractions, but I can tell you, when I was a Jehovah's Witness, I was firmly against them. I gave the matter a lot of thought, and I decided that if we weren't supposed to receive blood transfusions, then we certainly weren't supposed to donate it for others to use. And if donating blood was wrong, how could I, in good conscience, accept any product that had been made as a result of blood being extracted from another living being? Interestingly, in the case of immunoglobulin, it takes an awful lot of blood being extracted from an awful lot of living beings to make the stuff. In his 2007 book, In Search of Christian Freedom, the late Raymond Franz wrote the following regarding gamma globulins, of which immunoglobulins are the most significant. To produce sufficient gamma globulin for one injection by syringe of vaccination persons, including Jehovah's Witnesses, travelling to certain southern countries may take as protection against cholera, close to 3 litres of blood are needed as the source of supply. This is still more blood than is generally employed for a common blood transfusion. And again, the gamma globulin is drawn from blood that is stored, not poured out. And according to a 2005 medical paper titled Clinical Uses of Intravenous Immunoglobulin, intravenous immunoglobulin, IVIG, is a blood product prepared from the serum of between 1,000 and 15,000 donors per batch. So while Mark Sanderson may skirt over this issue of immunoglobulin as it pertains to conscience matters, if you happen to be a Jehovah's Witness, it would be worthwhile asking yourself this question. Would a wise and loving God really insist that I die refusing blood while allowing me to live by accepting a product derived from the blood of hundreds, if not thousands, of donors?
All of you as HLC brothers need to be well familiar with the principles that are found in the Kingdom Ministry insert on safeguarding our children. And you'll probably remember some of those principles. We know that many of our parents would like to see a situation where a doctor would come in and give a 100% guarantee that he will not transfuse their child during the medical or surgical procedure. But as we also know, most doctors, based on their medical and also their legal understanding, are not going to be willing to give that 100% assurance. But now what if the parents or the HLC is able to locate a physician who has many, many years of experience? This doctor has cooperated with witness families for many, many years. In fact, perhaps he's done this same procedure over and over again, and he has never used transfusion, or perhaps very seldom ever used transfusion. And now when he meets with the parents, he tells them, I feel very confident that I'm going to be able to do this procedure in your child, and I don't anticipate any problems. Well, given the circumstances, the parents may decide that this is the best option that they have. And they may decide that they can grant permission for the treatment to proceed without feeling that they have compromised their faith.
Finally, Mark Sanderson is talking in terms of consent and the decisions made by parents rather than simply in terms of what HLC elders should insist on. But even then, he's talking in terms of what parents may decide without discussing the ramifications for parents who don't follow his recommendations.
The parents may decide that this is the best option that they have. And they may decide that they can grant permission for the treatment to proceed without feeling that they have compromised their faith.
Surely I'm not the only one seeing the coercion here. Mark Sanderson isn't genuinely speculating about what Jehovah's Witness parents may decide. He's telling them what they should decide in a given situation. He's essentially telling HLC elders to cut parents some slack and not push for judicial or congregation action so long as they can demonstrate that they've jumped through hoops to find a doctor who can provide bloodless treatment for their child, even if the outcome still ends up being that the child receives blood.
What about the situation of mature minors or mature adolescents? Well, we know that many doctors are willing to respect the wishes of adult patients, but at times, in certain jurisdictions of the country, different places, a mature adolescent may be given the same rights as an adult to make their own medical decisions and even to refuse blood transfusions. In some cases, there's a fixed age for this, but in other places, there isn't. Sometimes it's based solely on the mature thinking ability of the young person. Sometimes, even if this has not been enshrined in the law of the state, some courts have recognized that mature adolescents do have this right to make their own decisions, but only when those adolescents are able to articulate their wishes and show that they really are able to make a mature decision. Maybe you remember the June 15th, 1991 issue of the Watchtower, page 17. There was a beautiful account of a 12-year-old girl who was being treated for leukemia. The judge interviewed that girl and asked what her opinion was. Well, the girl said that she would scream, she would struggle, she would pull out the lines. And because of the way she expressed herself, the judge said, "I refuse to make any order which would put this child through that ordeal. With this patient, the treatment proposed by the hospital addresses the disease only in a physical sense. It fails to address her emotional needs and her religious beliefs." Imagine, at 12, her wishes were respected as a mature minor because of the articulate way she was able to express herself. But on the other hand, if a young person is not able to express himself, doctors are going to treat them just as though they were an infant. In one case that's mentioned in that same article, the June 15, 91 Watchtower, there was a young man who was just 7 weeks away from the age of majority when he would be able to make his own decision. But when the judge interviewed him and asked him why was it he did not want a blood transfusion, he couldn't explain it. In fact, the judge asked him the names of the first 5 books of the Bible, and he couldn't give them. Well, what did the judge say? He said, his refusal to consent to blood transfusion is not based upon a mature understanding of his own religious beliefs. And the boy was transfused. Well, what does that show? What a wonderful responsibility parents have to teach their children, to use the family study as an opportunity to explain things in such a way that the children can make a defense of their faith so as to avoid a situation like this.
What a wonderful responsibility parents have. This, for me, is one of the most chilling parts of the video, because what Mark Sanderson is basically describing here is child indoctrination and its worst case scenario. He's describing to HLC elders the inevitable consequence of forcing a person to take a life or death religious stance before they are old enough to know themselves, let alone what their religious views are. And his answer to this problem of fooling judges into allowing the children of Jehovah's Witnesses to martyr themselves is to train children to be articulate.
Only when those adolescents are able to articulate their wishes. Imagine, at 12, her wishes were respected as a mature minor because of the articulate way she was able to express herself.
So it's not really about what the child of Jehovah's Witness parents believes. It's whether they can be articulate when it counts. It's whether they can put on a show and impress people that they hold beliefs that they are too young to understand. And the shining example of this that he points to is that of a 12-year-old girl mentioned in a 1991 Watchtower magazine. Why don't we read the paragraph in question? Matters may turn out differently for a minor well instructed in God's ways and actively walking in his truth. A younger Christian had the same rare type of cancer. The girl and her parents understood and accepted modified chemotherapy from a specialist at a noted hospital. Still, the case was taken to court. The judge wrote, DP testified she would resist having a blood transfusion in any way that she could. She considered a transfusion an invasion of her body and compared it to rape. She asked the court to respect her choice and permit her to continue at the hospital without court-ordered blood transfusions. the Christian instruction she had received came to her aid at this difficult time. Apparently, the Christian instruction that this girl received involved comparing receiving life-saving medical treatment to sexual assault. That's the sort of language that Jehovah's Witness children are expected to use in court. And by the way, it doesn't say, at least in the article, whether this girl lived or died. For all we know, these were among her final words. But how grotesque these words are. What an insult to genuine victims of rape to have life-saving medical treatment described in this way, and to have this verbiage prescribed for others to use. And I'll say one more thing before we move on to the next clip. And I'm hopefully stating the obvious here. Being articulate or even passionate about a given stance does not validate that stance or make you mature enough to truly hold it. Here's a number of examples of children of religious parents being articulate about their beliefs.
Like a man's church to the man's church of Pentecost, Pentecost is gonna do for the one Lord. Mississippi, where that Jackson is. Remember, the Lord done for us.
This is something that God called me to do, and that's something that God wants me to do, and this is what I want to do.
So it has nothing to do with the eagerness of your parents. It's something that entirely comes from you.
That I want to do.
I need to tell you this because God is a healer, He's a deliverer, He's protector, He's a comforter, He's provider. But I just want to say, He got my back.
He got your back.
Again, I realize I'm stating the obvious, but you can make a child as articulate about a religious position as you could possibly imagine, even to the point where they seem fully convinced. But you've proven nothing in terms of what the child's authentic ideas and beliefs are. All you've done is proven your ability to exploit childhood innocence and program a child to not express their ideas, but parrot yours.
Well, now let's change gears one last time and talk for a few minutes about some of the legal concepts and concerns of the state in relation to the treatment of infants and young children. What is the presumption of the law with regard to parents and their children? Well, it's always assumed that parents are going to make the very best decisions for their children. They have a natural and a legal right to make medical decisions on behalf of their children. But, of course, there are certain limitations to this. Many countries have established laws as well as child protection agencies to protect children from abuse and neglect. And certainly we have no objection to those arrangements because we don't want to see any child be abused or neglected. But now, when doctors want to transfuse one of our children by going to a child welfare agency, what can we do? Or when they want to go to the court, what can we do to protect ourselves? Well, if you only take one point home, please take this one, and that is contact HIS. Contact HIS. When there begins to be some word that the doctors are going to seek a court order or they're going to go to the Child Protection Agency. That was mentioned in the letter to all HLCs dated April 17, 2002. If there's time, it would be very advisable to seek the help of an attorney. In some cases, the court will even appoint an attorney to assist the family. Now, if the family doesn't retain an attorney or one is appointed, again, we want to get in touch with HIS because the legal department at the branch has information that they can share with the attorney that will help them to make the best possible defense of the family when they're in court.
Where is the parental consent here? If you're a Jehovah's Witness parent, please think about this for a second. The following, apparently, is the take-home message for 16,000 HLC elders, some of whom you may end up confiding in.
Contact HIS. Contact HIS. If the family doesn't retain an attorney or one is appointed, again, we want to get in touch with HIS.
Not ask the parents if they would like you to contact HIS on their behalf. Just contact HIS. Solicit the services of a third party in a medical emergency involving a child. A third party with a vested interest in making sure that child is denied life-saving treatment, regardless of whether it's what the child's parents want or ask for. That's essentially the message Mark Sanderson wants HLC elders to go home with.
Now, what's going to happen? It's good to have just a general idea of the process that's going to take place if this does go to court or if it goes to a child welfare agency. So first, the doctor is going to claim that a blood transfusion is needed to preserve the life and health of the child, and that the child is not mature enough to give consent, and that the parents refuse to give consent for this necessary legal medical procedure. Now, to overcome, point two, to overcome the refusal of the parents, the doctor is going to seek either approval from a court or from the child welfare agency, depending on the law of the state where you live. Invariably, this results in the parents being charged with medical neglect or with abuse in order to be able to get the court order. Third, the judge is asked to grant an order to either transfer the custody temporarily to another person or just to give the doctor the authority to go ahead and give the transfusion. Well, now, what is our defense? How are we going to defend ourselves under these circumstances? Well, we have to go back to the point that when we refuse to grant a blood transfusion for our children, it is not abuse and it is not neglect. And this is for three important reasons. I'll go through them one by one with you. Here's the first one. The parents are not refusing medical care. In fact, they were no doubt the ones that brought the child to the hospital. The only thing that they're refusing is the blood transfusion. Just that one medical intervention.
It's not that we refuse food for this starving man, Your Honour. This starving man who's about to collapse from malnutrition in the middle of a pie factory. We love this starving man and we want him to eat. It's just that for religious reasons, we object to him eating one particular type of food, namely pies. That's essentially the shady, devious, weaseling argument or defense that Mark Sanderson is suggesting should be used in court with a child's life on the line. The court case wouldn't be about whether parents object to medicine in general. The court case would clearly be about the parents objecting to a specific form of medical treatment on religious grounds. And HLC elders are here being encouraged to waste the court's time by obfuscating and dodging this central issue.
Number two, blood transfusion is not a completely safe procedure in and of itself. It's fraught with all kinds of different dangers. So it can't be said that refusing a transfusion is neglectful or abusive.
I have a question here for Mark Sanderson and indeed all Jehovah's Witnesses. What medical procedure is completely safe? What medical procedure, particularly of the sort that needs to be administered in a hospital, has a 100% rate of success? By Mark Sanderson's logic, Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't go to get hip replacements, shouldn't have pacemakers fitted, shouldn't have triple bypasses, shouldn't even have their broken bones fixed. A few years ago, I happened to break my arm playing football. Perhaps you can see on camera the scar. No, it's not showing that well. Because weirdly, they fixed it by inserting wire in my arm. But before they took me through the operation, the anaesthetist sat down with me and made it very clear that there was a chance, even if it was a very small chance, that the anaesthetic he was administering would kill me. It could not be completely ruled out that I would fall asleep for the operation and never wake up. and I had to sign a form exempting the hospital from liability in that event. Risks like that are taken in hospitals all the time, and blood transfusions are no exception. What Mark Sanderson is doing here is throwing up yet another red herring designed to confuse and obfuscate. The refusal of blood transfusions by Jehovah's Witnesses is not on medical grounds. It has nothing to do with fears over the risk from infected blood. Blood transfusions are refused by Jehovah's Witnesses solely on religious grounds, namely the belief that God forbids blood to humans, even in a life-saving medical context that could never have been envisioned by the writers of the Bible. That's what it's all about. But because he's a huckster and a charlatan, Mark Sanderson isn't interested in honesty, even when it comes to deciding the fate of dying children. He got where he is today by lying and promoting lies, and it's no surprise that he's encouraging similar dishonesty and bad faith argumentation in the HLC elders he is addressing.
And third, the parents want to have the opportunity to find doctors or institutions who are willing to treat the child using medical alternatives to blood transfusions, ways and means to avoid a transfusion.
There's that phrase, medical alternatives, a phrase we were urged to push as witnesses. Yes, in some instances, there are alternative forms of treatment that do not involve administering blood. We've already heard of one of them from self-proclaimed medical genius Mr. Mark Sanderson in this video, namely putting jaundiced babies in the sun. But seriously, this is another red herring. While some patients, due to their unique circumstances, may have the time and luxury to pick and choose from a buffet of alternative medical treatments for their specific condition, that won't be the case in all instances. Sometimes when life is on the line and the clock is ticking, there is only one realistic way that a person, in this case a child, is going to survive, and that's by receiving a blood transfusion. The alternative is death. Ultimately, this is not about whether there are medical alternatives to receiving a blood transfusion. Obviously there are. It's that in the view of Jehovah's Witnesses, there is no alternative but to refuse one.
Well, despite all of the efforts that are made, it's a kindness on your part to prepare the family to face the reality that despite even the best of defenses that are made in court, in most cases the judge is going to go ahead and grant the court order to transfuse unless one of these three things is true. Here's the first one. We've found a cooperative doctor who's willing to treat the child without blood, and he shows the judge that he has the ability to treat this in a responsible way. Number two, if we can convince the judge that there is no immediate emergency, it's not a life-threatening situation. Or number three, if we can convince the judge to order the doctor to exhaust all of the different alternatives before considering giving a donor blood transfusion. Well, ideally, as HLC brothers, we want to try to avoid going to court whenever possible. If there's any way around it, we want to avoid it. And one thing that you brothers all have is your life experience, you have your warm smile, you have your good people skills. Use all of those things to reason with the doctor and try to get him to avoid that blood transfusion or going to court to seek an order to transfuse.
If there is any doubt remaining among anyone that HLC elders interfere in life or death medical decisions, if any proof were needed that HLC elders are, as I've argued in a previous video, angels of death, who exploit the trust and goodwill of medical workers to gain a foothold in manipulating patient care, here it is as plain as day. In my opinion, every doctor, every hospital, every NHS trust, if you're watching in the UK, every lawmaker, quite frankly, should be watching this video and scrambling to fix this gaping hole in our healthcare that allows men in suits to stride into hospital wards, citing religious privilege, often having had the red carpet rolled out for them by the doctors and medical staff, and insert themselves in profoundly personal and intimate medical decisions. Mark Sanderson is plain as day saying, use your people skills. In other words, use your charm to hoodwink doctors into doing what we want them to do, even if it kills their patient. And I hope you noticed where Mark said the following.
Well, ideally, as HLC brothers, we want to try to avoid going to court whenever possible. If there's any way around it, we want to avoid it.
I'm going to take that sentence and change the words. Imagine if instead of saying this, Mark Sanderson had said, well, ideally, as human beings, we want to try to avoid a child dying wherever possible. If there's any way around it, we want to avoid it.
If there's any way around it, we want to avoid it.
If there's any way around it, we want to avoid it.
Doesn't this say it all? Doesn't this say everything about where the priorities of Jehovah's organization lie? They are more interested in shielding themselves from inconvenience in the form of litigation than saving the lives of children.
At the same time, keep working with the child welfare people, with the social workers, and help them not to be just a rubber stamp approving every request that a doctor might have for a blood transfusion. Educate them as to what the alternatives are so that perhaps they can even work with us and ask the doctor, well, have you exhausted all the alternatives first before they would ever consider going to a judge? Direction that's provided both by HIS and by the legal department can help you, brothers, so much to work for the very best possible outcome in these very, very difficult situations. So by employing all of the suggestions that we've discussed very briefly today, we can work to manage these pediatric and neonatal cases in the framework of the existing laws and make sure that the children that we love so much get the medical care that they need.
Yes, educate social workers, recruit them to your side. Convince them that it's in their interests to support your efforts to push a child towards martyrdom. Don't forget that HIS will be there to hold your hand through it all, whether or not the parents give you their consent to involve third parties in their child's medical care. Ultimately, it's all about managing these pediatric and neonatal cases and making sure children get whatever medical care they need, so long as it isn't a blood transfusion. It's flagrant, isn't it? Mark Sanderson is so drunk on power and control as a governing body member that behind closed doors, when he's addressing his doting minions, he can't help but let his guard down and just tell it like it is. Use your charm. Recruit social workers to support you. Use shady, underhanded reasoning in court. Pretend to know more about medicine than doctors and medical professionals who've studied and practiced it for years, if not decades. This is damning material that Mark would be horrified to learn is now out there for all to see. It totally lays bare the true agenda of HLC elders and how they are briefed to ride roughshod over the personal choice and consent of patients. If I had one wish, it would be for this particular video, more than any other video that I've ever made, to get seen, particularly by those who need to see it. Again, lawmakers and medical professionals, because people are dying due to this man and his colleagues and the dogma that they are pushing on their followers. It's no exaggeration to say that literally thousands of people are dying due to the prohibition of blood decided on by the Jehovah's Witness leadership in 1945 and enforced ever since. And now finally, we have some insight, perhaps the clearest insight ever into the inner workings of the goons who enforce the blood prohibition on penalty of shunning. Finally, a light has been shone on the HLC and its deadly, sinister strategizing. And I would like to end by profoundly thanking the brave individual who shared this material so that we can all take it in and hopefully do something about it. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.